In 2005, three black cousins vanished during a hide-and-seek game at their grandmother's house. 18 years later, workers opening a sealed basement room find a locked suitcase in the corner. The air that hissed out when the pry bar breached the old wooden door was stale, thick with the smell of trap time and something else, something faintly sweet and wrong. The workers, hired to clear out the condemned property before demolition, paused, their faces grimy in the beam of a single flashlight. The house had been empty for years, ever since Martha, the grandmother, had passed away. Her children, scattered and still grieving in their own ways, had finally agreed to let it go. They hadn't known about the sealed room, or if they had, no one ever spoke of it. The foreman shone his light on the suitcase. It was small, old-fashioned, the kind you might see in black and white movies, covered in a thick layer of undisturbed dust. Except for three crude letters drawn in what looked like faded black marker. L. M. S. Leo. Maya. Sam. The names punched the air out of the foreman. He'd heard the stories. Everyone in the small town had. The lost children. The endless searches. The theories that ranged from kidnapping to a tragic accident in the nearby woods. But never this. Never something hidden right under their noses, in the heart of the family home. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. What was inside that suitcase, and why was it locked? He told his men to back away, not to touch anything. He pulled out his phone, his fingers fumbling with the screen. This wasn't a job for demolition men. This was for the police. The news spread like a brush fire, reigniting an agony the families had learned to carry in muted silence. Sarah, Leo's mother, heard it on the local radio, the announcer's voice carefully neutral, yet every word a hammer blow. A sealed room, a suitcase, initials. She felt the world tilt, the carefully constructed dam of 18 years threatening to burst. She drove to her mother's old house, a place she'd avoided for nearly 2 decades, the memories too sharp, too raw. Police tape was already up, a stark yellow gash against the weathered gray paint of the porch. A detective, a man named Miller, met her at the perimeter. His eyes were kind but guarded. He confirmed the basics. Yes, a suitcase. Yes, the initials. No, they hadn't opened it yet. Not until forensics arrived. Sarah just stared at the house, at the dark, accusing window of the basement, a room she never knew existed. How could there be a room she didn't know? She'd played in that house as a child, explored every nook and cranny, or so she thought. The detective asked if she knew anything about a sealed-off section of the basement. She shook her head, numb. Her mother, Martha, had been a private woman, especially in her later years. Her grief a fortress. But this felt like something more than privacy. It felt like a secret, cold and heavy, buried in the foundations of their lives. What had her mother hidden? And why? The sun began to set, casting long, mournful shadows. The weight was unbearable. Every minute stretched, filled with a terrifying blend of hope and dread. Hope that this might finally bring answers. Dread for what those answers might be. What could a locked suitcase, hidden for 18 years, possibly tell them about 3 children who had simply disappeared? The forensic team arrived, their movements precise and impersonal. They documented the room first. A small, windowless space, barely larger than a closet. The walls were damp stone, the floor concrete. There was nothing else inside. Just the suitcase, sitting in the far corner as if placed there with intention. Detective Miller watched them work, his mind racing. Why seal a room? To hide something, obviously. But what? And who did the sealing? Martha? If so, when? Before the children vanished, or after? The implications of after were chilling. He thought of the initial reports from 2005, the frantic searches, the scent dogs losing the trail at the edge of the woods, the family's despair. Martha had been devastated. Everyone agreed. Or had she been acting? The thought was ugly, but he couldn't dismiss it. The suitcase was carefully bagged and taken to the lab. Sarah, along with Maya's father and Sam's mother, were asked to come to the station. The air in the small waiting room was thick with unspoken fears. They sat apart, united by a tragedy, yet isolated in their individual pain. 18 years, an entire childhood, gone, and now this fragile, impossible hope. Miller finally came to them. He looked tired. He told them the suitcase was old, but the marker initials seemed fresher than the dust. He paused. Inside, he said, his voice low, they found drawings. Children's drawings. And letters. Unsent letters. A wave of dizziness hit Sarah. Drawings. Letters. From her son? From Maya? From Sam? Were they messages? Her hands clenched. What did they say? What did they draw? Were they trying to tell someone something? The detective's next words hung heavy in the air. The drawings depicted dark spaces, stick figures that looked small and scared. One drawing showed a door with a large, elaborate lock, a lock none of them had ever seen on any door in Martha's house. And the letters, they were simple, heartbreaking. Small, childish hands pleading to go home, asking why they were there, asking for their parents. The realization hit them all at once. The children hadn't just vanished from the yard during hide and seek. They had been in that room, but for how long? And were they alone? The suitcase wasn't just a collection of lost items. It was a testament, a voice from a sealed tomb. The question that clawed at Sarah, at all of them, was terrifyingly simple. Did Martha know they were in there? The old woman, their mother, their grandmother, who had wept with them, who had prayed with them, had she known? The silence in the room was a living thing, pressing down on them. Miller let it sit. He then asked, very gently, about Martha, about her routines, her state of mind around the time the children disappeared, and in the years that followed. Had she ever mentioned that room? Had she ever acted strangely about the basement? Maya's father, a quiet man named Thomas, spoke for the first time. His voice was hoarse. He said Martha became very protective of the basement after the disappearances. She'd always said it was damp, unsafe. She'd put a new, heavy padlock on the main basement door not long after. They'd all assumed it was just her grief, her fear. But what if it was something else? What if she was hiding more than just old furniture and cobwebs? What secrets died with Martha in that silent, sealed-off part of the house? Detective Miller knew this case, cold for 18 years, had just cracked wide open, exposing something raw and deeply unsettling. The focus shifted from a possible outside abduction to the house itself, to the family, to Martha. He needed to understand that sealed room. When was it sealed? By whom? And most importantly, why? He ordered a thorough search of Martha's remaining belongings, things her children had packed away into boxes, stored in an attic, reluctant to sort through the remnants of a life intertwined with so much pain. He also put a team onto the history of the house itself. Deeds, renovation permits, anything that might indicate when that section of the basement was walled off. The drawings from the suitcase were laid out on a large table in the evidence room, childlike, yet chilling. One drawing, presumably by Leo, the eldest, showed 3 small figures huddled together in a dark square. Above them, a larger, shadowy figure with no discernible features. Was this a captor? Or just a child's representation of fear, of the unknown? Another, by Maya, depicted a single barred window, though the sealed room had no windows. Was it a memory of another place, or an imagined hope of escape? Sam, the youngest, had drawn what looked like a plate of food, but scribbled over it in angry red crayon. What did that mean? Were they fed? Were they neglected? The letters were even more direct, more heartbreaking. Dear Mommy, I want to come home. It's dark here. Leo is scared, but he tries to be brave. Love, Maya. Another, in Leo's more practiced hand, said, We are in the basement. Grandma locked the door. Please come get us. Grandma locked the door. Sarah's breath hitched when Miller read that line to her. Her own mother. It couldn't be. Martha had adored those children. She couldn't, or could she? Grief did strange things to people. Had Martha somehow accidentally locked them in, panicked, and then, what? Let them stay there? The thought was monstrous, unfathomable. Yet, the letter. Miller pressed Sarah, gently, but firmly. Did Martha have any history of mental instability? Forgetfulness? Paranoia? Sarah racked her brain. Martha had become more reclusive after her husband died, years before the children vanished. She was fiercely independent, sometimes stubborn, but not cruel, never cruel. Yet, that sealed room, that letter, the pieces were forming a terrifying picture. What if the hide-and-seek game had gone terribly wrong? What if one of them had found a way into that already sealed, or perhaps recently sealed, forgotten room, and the others followed? And what if the door had somehow locked behind them, a door Martha herself had secured, not knowing they were inside? And then she heard them, or thought she heard something. And in her aging mind, perhaps already clouded by early dementia or an undiagnosed issue, she dismissed it, or worse, became afraid. The questions multiplied, each more agonizing than the last. Had her mother heard her grandchildren crying for help and done nothing? The weight of that possibility was crushing. Had they been alive, just feet away, while everyone searched the woods, the town, their faces on missing posters? The silence of that house, for 18 years, suddenly felt deafening, accusatory. What other secrets did its walls hold? The investigation into the house's history yielded a crucial piece of information. The sealed room wasn't part of the original construction. A permit had been filed by Martha's husband, Frank, nearly 30 years before the children disappeared, for basement storage modifications. It seemed Frank had sectioned off that part of the basement himself. Why, the permit didn't say. Frank had passed away 5 years before the tragedy. So Martha knew about the room. It wasn't a forgotten relic. It was a space her husband had created, a space she would have been aware of. Miller's team revisited the basement, not the sealed room, but the main area. They found the old padlock Thomas, Maya's father, had mentioned. It was rusted shut. They had to cut it open. Inside, the main basement was as expected. Dusty, cluttered with old furniture, discarded tools, forgotten things. But on the wall that had once contained the door to the sealed room, they found faint markings, almost invisible under layers of grime and new paint. Scratches. Long, desperate scratches, concentrated around the area where the doorframe had been. Some were low to the ground, as if made by a small hand, or fingernails. Sarah felt sick when Miller told her. She imagined her son, her nieces, trapped, trying to claw their way out. The thought of their small hands, scraping against unyielding wood and stone, was an image that would haunt her forever. What kind of fear, what kind of desperation, would drive them to that? And how long had they scratched? Hours? Days? The contents of the suitcase were analyzed further. The marker used for the initials L, M, S was a common brand, nothing unique. But the paper used for the drawings and letters was from a specific type of art pad, one that Martha often bought for the grandchildren when they visited. This small detail tightened the noose of probability. The children had those materials with them, or found them, inside that room, which meant they were there for more than just a few panicked minutes. They had time to draw, time to write, time to realize they were trapped, time to be hungry, time to be terrified. Miller brought Sarah and the other parents back in. He had to ask the hardest questions now. He showed them a photograph of a small, tarnished silver locket, found tucked into a corner of the suitcase, beneath the letters. It was heart-shaped, intricately engraved. Sarah gasped. "That was my mother's," she whispered. "She always wore it. It was her mother's before her. She remembered Martha complaining she'd lost it, maybe a year or two before the children went missing. She'd been upset about it. How did it get into that suitcase? With the children? Did one of them find it somewhere in the house and take it into their hiding spot? Or did she put it there herself? As a token? A memory? Or something else? The locket was a tangible link between Martha and that sealed space, more personal than the art supplies. It felt like a deliberate placement. But why? What did it signify? Was it an apology? A confession? Or was it something Martha cherished, and one of the children had taken it, a small act of defiance or a treasured secret, into their final hiding place? The ambiguity was maddening. Each clue seemed to point towards Martha's knowledge, her involvement, however passive or active it might have been. But the motive, the exact sequence of events, remained shrouded in the fog of the past, in the silence of a woman who took her secrets to her grave. Had she been a monster? Or a victim herself, trapped by fear, by dementia, by a terrible, irreversible mistake? The lines blurred, and the truth felt more elusive, more painful than ever. What really happened in that house in 2005? The midpoint of the investigation arrived with a quiet, sickening thud. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation, but a slow, dawning horror. Miller, piecing together the timeline, the letters, the locket, began to consider the unthinkable, that Martha hadn't just passively known, but had, in some way, facilitated their confinement, perhaps not even maliciously at first. Could the hide-and-seek game have been a trigger for a confused, elderly woman? The letter from Leo, "Grandma locked the door," echoed in his mind. What if she had locked it, thinking it was just part of the game, or to keep them safe from something she imagined was in the main basement, and then her mind, already failing, simply forgot? Or worse, what if she knew, and her reasons were more complex, more disturbing? He went back to the house, now a cold, echoing crime scene. He stood in the main basement, staring at the freshly exposed wall where the sealed room's door had been. He tried to imagine Martha. What would she have heard? Faint cries? Scratching? For how long would she have had to hear them before they stopped? Days? A week? The thought was unbearable. You start to question everything you thought you knew about someone. The family had always described Martha as loving, if a bit stern. But grief and age could warp a person, twist them into someone unrecognizable. Miller recalled a detail from the original missing persons report. A neighbor had mentioned hearing odd sounds from Martha's basement a few days after the children disappeared, like muffled banging. At the time, it was dismissed. Martha had said it was probably rats, or the old house settling. The police, focused on an abduction theory, hadn't pressed. Now, that neighbor's casual comment loomed large. Had those been the children? Still alive? Still hoping? This was the spike. The moment the investigation shifted from tragic accident to potential criminal neglect, or worse. Miller felt a cold knot in his stomach. He had to consider that Martha might have intentionally kept them there. But why? This wasn't a ransom situation. There was no note, no demand. Could it have been a twisted form of protection? Did she fear they'd be taken by someone outside, and in her deteriorating mental state, believe this was the only way to keep them safe? Or was there something in that room she didn't want them, or anyone, to find, and they'd stumbled upon it? The locket. Why was it there? If she'd lost it a year or two prior, it could mean one of the children found it and kept it. But if she hadn't lost it, if that was a lie, and she placed it there herself, what did that signify? A desperate, silent apology? A marker? A way of leaving a piece of herself with them? The team working on Martha's belongings found her diaries. Years of them. They were mostly mundane. Weather, church, complaints about her arthritis. But in the entries around the time the children vanished, there was a change. The handwriting became more erratic. There were strange, almost childlike drawings in the margins. And then, a week after they went missing, one chilling entry: "The house is quiet now. Too quiet. They are finally sleeping. Sleeping. Not gone. Not missing. Sleeping." Miller read it, and the hair on his arms stood up. This wasn't the diary of a grieving grandmother. This was something else. Something terrifyingly calm. He called Sarah and the other parents. He had to tell them. The room was sterile, official, but the news he delivered shattered any remaining vestiges of composure. Sarah stared at the photocopy of the diary page, her mother's familiar handwriting suddenly alien, monstrous. "Sleeping?" she choked out. "She wrote they were sleeping?" Thomas, Maya's father, slammed his fist on the table, a single, sharp crack in the awful silence. Sam's mother just wept, silent tears streaming down her face. The implication was clear. Martha knew they were in that room, and she knew when they stopped. The word "sleeping" was a horrifying euphemism. The suitcase, the drawings, the letters, they weren't just messages from the trap. They were a record of their final days, their final hopes, all happening while their grandmother was just upstairs, living her life, writing in her diary. The betrayal was absolute, a poisonous knife twisting in a wound that would never heal. Why would a grandmother do this? What darkness had resided in Martha? The house itself seemed to groan under the weight of its secrets. Investigators combed through every inch of Martha's life, searching for an explanation, a reason, however mad, for her actions. The diaries were key. As they read further, a disturbing pattern emerged in the months leading up to the children's disappearance. Martha wrote increasingly about shadows in the house, about whispers in the walls. She mentioned her late husband, Frank, and the bad things he kept in the basement. There was a growing paranoia, a fear that something was trying to get out, or get in. Could it be that Frank, her husband, had used that sealed room for something sinister? Something Martha discovered or suspected only after his death? And when the children, in their innocence, stumbled into it during their game, did Martha panic, believing they had unleashed or encountered this bad thing? Did she lock them in, not to harm them, but to contain what she feared was with them, or to protect them from what she imagined was outside? This was a new, horrifying angle. It painted Martha not as a cold-blooded monster, but perhaps as a woman unraveling, lost in a terrifying delusion. Detective Miller found a retired officer who had been a rookie on the original case. He remembered Martha. He said she seemed oddly calm for a grieving grandmother, but they'd chalked it up to shock. He also recalled Martha repeatedly saying the children were safer now, a phrase that, at the time, everyone assumed meant they were in heaven. Now, it had a chillingly different connotation. Safer from what? The shadows she wrote about. Or safer from the outside world? In her twisted logic, the team analyzing the suitcase found something else, almost missed. Tucked into the lining, so thin it felt like part of the fabric, was a folded piece of paper, different from the art pad paper. It was brittle, yellowed with age. On it, in faint, spidery handwriting, Frank's handwriting, confirmed by old letters, was a single sentence. She must never know what's in the walls. What was in the walls? The sealed room wasn't just a room. It was inside the walls of the original basement structure. Had Frank hidden something there? Money? Documents? Something illegal? Something that, if discovered, could destroy his family or his memory? And had Martha, in her later years, started to suspect? Did her paranoia about whispers stem from a dawning, terrifying realization about her husband and that hidden space? Imagine the scene. The children play hide and seek. They find a loose board, a hidden catch, a way into this sealed-off section of the basement, a place Martha herself might have been too afraid to enter, or had only recently become fixated on, due to her husband's cryptic note, perhaps found long after his death. They go in. The door closes, or Martha, hearing noises from the forbidden place, and already in a state of heightened paranoia, slams it shut and locks it, believing she is containing her husband's secret, or protecting the children from it in some confused way. The letters from the children, "Grandma locked the door," now took on an even more tragic light. They weren't accusing her of malice, perhaps, but stating a bewildered fact. Their grandmother, who they trusted, had locked them in. They wouldn't understand her fear, her delusions. They would only know they were trapped. And Martha, her mind a tangle of fear, grief, and delusion, might have convinced herself it was necessary. They are finally sleeping. Perhaps in her mind, they were finally safe from the bad things her husband had hidden, or from the shadows that haunted her. This didn't absolve her, but it painted a portrait of a tragedy born not just of evil, but perhaps of mental illness, fear, and a dark family secret that festered for decades. The what Frank hid remained a mystery. The room, when opened, contained only the suitcase and dust. Had he removed his secrets before he died? Or were they never physical objects, but deeds, memories, things that haunted Martha and led her to this terrible end for her grandchildren? The question hung unanswered. The focus now shifted to Frank, Martha's deceased husband. What kind of man had he been? What secrets could he have had that were so terrible they could lead, indirectly, to the deaths of his own grandchildren? The family members, Sarah, Thomas, and Sam's mother, were questioned again. What did they remember about Frank? He had been a quiet man, they said, kept to himself, worked as a stonemason, often taking on side jobs, some of them undocumented. He was known for being meticulous, strong, but also stern, a man of few words. No one recalled him being overtly cruel, but he had a temper, they admitted. And he had been very possessive of the basement. He'd always told the children, when they were young, to stay out of it. It was his workspace, he'd said. Off limits. Could the bad things Martha wrote about be connected to his work? Had he been involved in something illegal? Stolen goods? Hidden money? Or something darker? Miller had the sealed room re-examined, minutely. This time, they weren't just looking for clues about the children, but for anything Frank might have hidden. They tapped the stone walls, checked the concrete floor for any signs of tampering, any hollow spots. Nothing. It was as if whatever Frank had been concerned about had either been removed or was never a physical object. Perhaps his note, "She must never know what's in the walls," was a metaphor. Maybe it referred to his own dark thoughts, his regrets, his fears that he felt were embedded in the very fabric of the house he'd worked on, the house he lived in. A psychological haunting, rather than a physical one, that Martha had inherited or absorbed. The drawing from the suitcase, the one by Maya showing a barred window, was re-examined. There were no barred windows in the basement. But Frank had done some work at the old county jailhouse years ago, repair work. Could Maya have overheard him talking about it? Or seen a picture? Or was it a child's symbolic representation of being trapped? The threads were becoming more tangled, more speculative. The core truth, that the children died in that room, known to Martha, was firm. But the why behind Martha's actions remained elusive, buried with her and Frank. Sarah found an old photo album. In it, a picture of her father, Frank, standing proudly in front of the newly renovated basement, the section that would later be sealed off. He was younger, smiling, but there was something in his eyes, a hardness that the smile didn't quite reach. Behind him, you could just make out the edge of a new, heavy-looking door he'd installed to that section, a door that seemed far too secure for simple storage. What had he been so intent on protecting or hiding? The suitcase yielded one final, tiny clue. Pressed deep into one of the drawings, as if by a small, determined finger, was a tiny fleck of something blue. Not crayon, not paint, it was analyzed. It was a fragment of denim, old, weathered denim, the kind work clothes were made of. Frank's work clothes. Had one of the children been holding onto a piece of his old overalls? Or had it been snagged on something in the room, something left behind from Frank's time? It was another dead end, another whisper from the past that offered no clear answer. The tragedy felt immense, a cascade of secrets and failures. Frank's secrets, whatever they were. Martha's descent into paranoia and fear, her inability to comprehend or act rationally. And the children, innocent victims caught in a web they couldn't see or understand. Their last days, documented in heartbreakingly simple terms, were a testament to their quiet suffering, their unanswered pleas. The weight of it all settled heavily on Detective Miller. This wasn't a case with a clear villain to apprehend, just a devastating chain of events leading to an unimaginable loss. How do you find justice when the person responsible is dead, and her motives are lost to madness or a fear no one can now comprehend? The search for Frank's hidden something continued, more out of a desperate need for completeness than any real hope of finding answers that would change the outcome for the children. If he had hidden money or valuables, they were long gone, or never there. If it was evidence of a crime, it was too old, too vague to pursue. The note, "She must never know what's in the walls," seemed increasingly like the paranoid ramblings of a troubled man, a seed that had taken root in Martha's already fracturing mind. The investigation was winding down. There would be no arrests. The primary subject, Martha, was dead. The cause of the children's death, as determined by a forensic pathologist reviewing the implied evidence from the suitcase and the diary, would likely be listed as neglect, starvation, dehydration, exposure, all occurring within the confines of that sealed room. A slow, terrible end. Sarah, Thomas, and Sam's mother had to confront this. Their children hadn't been snatched by a stranger. They hadn't wandered off and succumbed to an accident in the woods. They had died in their grandmother's house, just feet away from safety, because of a confluence of secrets, fear, and deteriorating mental health. It was a truth almost too heavy to bear. Sarah remembered Martha's hands, how they'd knit blankets for Leo when he was a baby, how she'd hummed old church hymns while baking cookies. How could those same hands have sealed a door knowing her grandchildren were behind it? Or, if she locked it in a moment of confusion, how could she have ignored their cries, their scratches, their pleas, for days? The diary entry, "They are finally sleeping," was the most damning evidence of her awareness, her chilling acceptance. Had she convinced herself it was an act of mercy? That their sleep was a release from the shadows or the bad things she perceived. The town mourned anew. The story of the lost cousins had been a local tragedy for years. Now it was a horror story, a dark fairy tale with a real-life monster who had once been a beloved grandmother. The house, already condemned, became a focal point of morbid curiosity before the demolition crews finally moved in. As the walls came down, it felt like a heavy shroud was being lifted, though the darkness it had contained would linger forever in the town's memory and in the hearts of the families. There was a small, private memorial service for Leo, Maya, and Sam. Their names were finally etched onto headstones, a definitive, heartbreaking end to 18 years of uncertainty. The suitcase and its contents were returned to the families. The drawings, the letters, the locket, they were unbearable to look at, yet impossible to discard. They were the only voices their children had left. Sarah held Leo's last letter, his childish scrawl pleading for help, pleading for her. Grandma locked the door. Such a simple sentence, such a universe of pain. She would never understand how it had come to this. How a game of hide-and-seek in a familiar, loving place could end in a sealed room, in silence, in a locked suitcase filled with the last whispers of her child. The questions would always remain, festering beneath the surface of grief. What exactly did Frank hide? What was the final trigger for Martha's actions? Could anyone have intervened? Could they have seen the signs of her unraveling? The guilt, the what-ifs, would be their lifelong companions. The demolition of Martha's house was swift. Where it once stood, there was now just an empty lot, raw earth scarred by bulldozer tracks. But the story, the truth of what happened there, couldn't be so easily erased. It seeped into the soil, into the collective memory of the community. Detective Miller closed the case file. Deaths by neglect. Perpetrator deceased. It was a sterile, official summary for such a profound, human tragedy. He knew the families would never truly have closure. How could they? The betrayal was too deep, the loss too absolute. Sarah often found herself thinking about the locket. Her grandmother's locket, found with the children. Had Martha, in a moment of lucidity, of remorse, placed it there as a final, silent confession? A way of saying, I was here, I knew, or was it just another random object, caught up in the chaos of those last terrible days? She would never know. The ambiguity of Martha's motives, was it calculated cruelty, a descent into madness, or a complex mix of fear and delusion fueled by her husband's old secrets, made the grieving process even harder. It's easier to mourn a clear evil than a confused, broken one that was once loved. Thomas, Maya's father, found a small measure of solace in anger. Anger at Frank for his secrets, anger at Martha for her actions, or inactions. It was a burning, cleansing fire, though he knew it would eventually leave him empty. Sam's mother simply withdrew, the light in her eyes dimmed, her grief a quiet, constant presence. The three cousins, Leo, Maya, and Sam, remained forever young in photographs, their bright, innocent smiles a stark contrast to the darkness that had consumed their final days. Their story became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of how secrets can fester, how mental health can deteriorate unseen, and how easily the unthinkable can become reality, even within the supposed safety of a family. The suitcase, with its precious, heartbreaking contents, was eventually placed in a memorial display at the local historical society. At Sarah's insistence, she wanted people to remember not just the tragedy, but the children themselves, their words, their drawings, their brief, stolen lives. It was a testament to their existence, a final, faint cry against the silence that had swallowed them. The sealed room was gone, but the questions it had unearthed would echo for a long, long time. What darkness can hide behind a familiar face? What secrets can a family home truly hold? And how do you ever recover from a truth that shatters everything you thought you knew about love and loss and the very people you called your own? The silence left behind was the loudest sound of all. The lot where Martha's house once stood remained empty for a long time. No one wanted to build there. It was as if the ground itself held a memory of the sorrow, a chill that even the summer sun couldn't quite dispel. Sarah, Thomas, and Sam's mother tried to move forward, but the shadows of Leo, Maya, and Sam were long. Anniversaries were the hardest. Birthdays, the start of school years they'd never attend. The small, everyday moments that reminded them of what they had lost, and how the community, too, felt the lingering unease. People would walk by the empty lot and cross the street, or whisper as they passed. The story of the cousins in the sealed room became a local legend, a dark stain that time might fade but never fully wash away. Detective Miller often thought about the case. Of all the investigations he'd handled, this one stayed with him. The image of those childish drawings, the desperate letters, the thought of their final days in that dark, cold room. It wasn't just the deaths, it was the proximity of help, the betrayal by someone they should have been able to trust implicitly. He wondered about Martha's diaries, her descent into paranoia. Had Frank's secrets truly been so terrible, or had they simply been the catalyst for a mind already predisposed to fracture? Sometimes, he'd drive past the empty lot. He'd see children playing in nearby yards, their laughter bright and carefree, and a pang would hit him. For Leo, Maya, and Sam, their laughter had been silenced too soon, in the most unimaginable way. The suitcase, in its glass case at the Historical Society, drew quiet visitors. Some were curious, some were mournful, some were parents themselves, who looked at the drawings and felt a cold knot of fear and empathy. The childish script, the pleas for help, they were a universal language of vulnerability, of innocence lost. Grandma locked the door. That sentence, so simple, so devastating, became the epitaph of the tragedy. Sarah eventually started a small foundation in her son's name and in memory of his cousins. It focused on raising awareness for child safety, but also, quietly, on providing resources for families dealing with elderly members suffering from dementia or other mental health issues. It was her way of trying to wring some meaning from the senselessness, to prevent another family from experiencing such a horror. But the peace she sought was elusive. At night, she would sometimes dream of the sealed room, of the scratching sounds the investigators had found. She would wake up with a start, her heart pounding, the image of her mother's face, not as she remembered her from childhood, loving and kind, but as she must have been in those final, terrible days, her expression unreadable, her motives forever shrouded. The truth, when it finally came, had not been liberating. It had been a different kind of prison, one built of grief, betrayal, and unanswerable questions. The story of the three cousins didn't end with the demolition of the house or the closing of a police file. It ended in the quiet moments of sorrow, in the lingering chill of that empty lot, in the drawings that spoke of a hope that died in the dark. It was a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not strangers, but those hidden within the folds of a family, concealed by familiarity and a love that had somewhere, somehow, gone terribly, tragically wrong. Have you ever heard of anything like this? Share your thoughts or stories in the comments.